Welcome everyone. It is 3 p.m. and it's time for the server room show. This is episode 23. Thank you for SDF Public Unix Systems for hosting the server. Today's episode 23 and the next Saturday's episode 24 will be dedicated to a two-part interview I did with George, Neville, Neil, talking about BSD, computers and many other things in general. As normally, there is a call-in option during this show. It's not gonna be available now for this episode 23 and next episode 24 because you will listen after this introduction. You will listen to the first part of this interview I did with George, and in episode 24 you will listen to the second half and the end of the interview, and I will close it with some of my personal thoughts and kind of like an epilogue. As always, you can find the information regarding the show on the website victormadaras.freeshell.net. Victor Madaras is spelled with K the kilo and Sevilla, Zimbabwe on the end, so victormadaras.freeshell.net. It's better like that because you can find all the information there regarding contact information and where to find show notes, where to download the video recordings, where to find the previous episode, so I don't need to waste a lot of time with the general introduction, as someone pointed out to me that it's best to keep short, so like that we don't waste that much time for the 30-minute slot we have. Once both half of this interview airs, I will upload the whole unedited video of 45-minute interview, and the whole interview which was concluded with George, to the show, the server room show's video channel of that PeerTube instance, and you can watch the video there in one piece. But I wanted to take advantage and break it up to two parts, so people who listen to this as a form of a podcast or only listening to it at anonradio.net, as the slot is there is 30 minutes, they have an option to listen to the full interview just in two parts without need to shorten it or cut pieces out of it. So I hope you will enjoy it. I really enjoyed making it, and for the future I have probably another BSD, FreeBSD person interview coming up if everything goes okay. So George was the first one in this line of interviews, and hopefully there is more to come. I also want to do at some point another episode regarding BSD history, so you can get a better understanding or a better knowledge of where this BSD thing comes from and what does it mean for us today, because as you see, the world tends to think only in Linux and in Linux terms, and there are much more other things out there. Linux is not your only option. You have BSD and the BSD like Unix distributions as your option, like FreeBSD, NetBSD, even OpenBSD. So after this long introduction, I wasted some time. Please listen and enjoy the first half of the interview with George, Neville, Neil. George, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. I know that you're a busy man, even though it was a bit hard for me to find any information about you on Wikipedia or elsewhere when I was trying to know you a bit more or prepare, study you a little bit more before writing up the questions. And thank you for agreeing to this sit down and to talk a little bit about you and about what you do, so people in and out of the community of SDF, Public Access Unix System, can have a chance to know you a little bit better.
Happy to do it.
There is no information about you online. I don't know how you managed to do that with all the things you did so far, being involved.
Well, I mean, I guess mostly what people would find were my talks, because most of my talks have been recorded.
Yes, I managed to watch one or two, and it helped me to form a better understanding and come up with some of the questions, pretty much, hopefully the ones which made a bit more sense. So, what's your earliest memories of a computer, or did you grow up around them?
So I grew up with a lot of technology because my father was a tinkerer the same way everyone else in my family is. My first exposure to computers was in middle school, or junior high school, we call it here in the States, where we had two of the early Commodore PET computers, which were green screen, 8-bit, 6502 based computers that ran BASIC. We had two of those in a math lab kind of thing. Nobody really knew what to do with them, but that was my first exposure to computers.
And you got caught, drawn into them early on, or it came? So you had a normal youth period, like average normal, we call them normal people, and you remembered computer later on, when you got into, as you did, eventually you did computer sciences in a university in Boston, or you had a fixed focus?
So I was definitely into computers as a kid, but they were very expensive, remember, when I was young. So my first experience was with these two machines that were sitting in one of the math classes. And then when personal computers became a thing, I got my first personal computer was a TI 994A, which I got for Christmas one year. And I did some programming on that. And then the next year I got myself a Commodore 64, which I bought with money working after school. And so it was the Commodore 64 was kind of my first real computer for myself. I guess I was about 15. And once I was in high school, we had access to various types of computers. We had a lab full of Commodore PET computers. We had access to what at that point were somewhat older mini computers shared by many of the high schools in the suburb where I grew up. Those were all DEC systems. I learned to code assembly on the DEC system. I learned Fortran on the DEC systems. I wrote BASIC on the Commodores. And we had a couple of Apple IIs that ran CP/M, which was interesting to me because it was the only thing that presented an operating system I could really play with. We weren't allowed to mess with the operating system on the DEC systems for obvious reasons because they were a shared resource. So I spent a lot of time in the computer lab. I spent a lot of time programming my Commodore 64, and around the age of 16, I got my first job programming computers. I had taught myself the language that was used to do DBase programming. DBase was an early database for personal computers from Ashton Tate, and a friend of mine who was a little older had been helping an insurance company in my hometown put all of their records online. And when he went off to college, I took his job working on DBase. So my earliest paid job was doing DBase work on IBM PCs. So yeah, I spent a lot of my time with computers as a teenager. And then, as you say, went off to university and studied computer science.
DBase were early on in relational databases, no? I remember them vaguely from the DOS era. My father used them, DBase 3 and even DBase 4.
3.
Yeah.
Yep. So DBase 2 was available in our high school for some random reason. I have no idea what they were using it for, but anytime there was a new piece of software that had some sort of computer language to it, I would try to learn that piece of software. So I learned DBase 2, and then this friend was working on DBase 3, and it wasn't that big a jump. I mean, now you look back at it, and it's fairly simple, 1 or 2 page programs to extract the data from the database. There was a whole group of something like 4 people who were just inputting all of the records off of paper onto the computer. Run by this, I mean, the insurance company had one or 2 salesmen, the owner and I think one of his sons or something, and then a bunch of people who were office workers, and the office workers were all just taking tons of paper and typing it into various forms that went into this DBase stuff that all sat on a little hard drive. And I wrote programs to extract data from it. But relational, I don't think DBase 3 was completely relational in the way that we think of a modern SQL style database. It really was kind of just pulling forms out of a table. Might have had relational features, but most of what was exposed to the programmer was not an SQL-like language. I don't remember the language very well because it's now 40 years ago. Not quite 40 years ago, more than 35 years ago. But it was very much more like, here's a key, find all the things related to this key.
But in its time, it was innovative enough, and
oh, sure, and
it was
paid
well
for
spread.
some of my college, so that was good.
Yeah. And you mentioned CP per M. Probably which as it piqued your interest and you got fascinated with it. Could it be that it had any involvement, made you somehow get involved or know more about BSD back in the day?
So I wasn't introduced to BSD until my freshman year of college, which was 1985. The systems I had access to, the mini computers ran TOPS 20. TOPS 20 or TOPS 10? They ran TOPS, which was DEC's, before VMS was DEC's premier mini computer operating system. And I had a friend who worked at the computer center that served all of our high schools, and so we used to spend evenings printing out the assembly language code of the operating system, and we should probably put that operating system in quotes. I mean, it was an operating system, but we would print out on green bar paper the assembly dumps of chunks of the code, and then we would try to figure out what it did. And this is a very common way of learning software when I was young. You didn't have access to the source code. There was no open source at the time. There was free software, so you could see other kinds of software. But places like DEC or IBM or any of those things, they didn't produce their operating systems for other people to look at. They were provided as binaries. So we would dump the assembly code. We did the same thing for the Commodore 64. We dumped the entire ROM, and we would just sit there with green bar paper and a pen and just go through and try to figure out what the functions did and try to figure out where they were and learn how the system worked. So that was kind of my introduction to low-level systems and being interested in how an operating system worked. Because the operating system was the thing that had control over the machine. The programs had to ask the operating system for services, but the operating system was the piece of software that dealt directly with the hardware. And that actually is the thing I've always been interested in, is the software that's as close as possible to the underlying hardware and that provides the services. I mean, I write application programs as well, but they're not as interesting to me as things that actually manage bits or move things around in the hardware.
So after this introduction to BSD and that you figured out that you yourself are interested in being as slow as possible and close to the hardware, and you definitely don't want to spend your time writing applications which you can follow a mouse cursor and draw images. Was it then when you went to Wind River as a continuation, as they took over BSDI?
So actually, I was at Wind River long before the interaction with BSDI. So I joined Wind River in 1996. I had worked for a company that was using Wind River's VxWorks in a product. So that's how I learned about VxWorks. Wind River used to have a 1 week training class, to teach people how to build systems with their operating system. It was a really good class. I became friends when I went to work at Wind River with Nelson, who ran the entire training group, and I was very impressed with the training course that they had set up, and determined that I wanted to go work for a company that built embedded operating systems. So I applied for a job in the networking group of Wind River and got that job and went to work there in 1996. The acquisition of BSDI was much later, I think 2000, 1999. So my original involvement with BSD is actually a little before that. So I worked at the University of California for about a year and a half on a infrastructure project, helping them build what we would now call a package system. So the entire university was sharing over NFS all of the various open source packages like Emacs or languages or various packages. And I worked for Eric Allman. Eric Allman is the original author of SendMail, and he is married to the original author of the fast file system, Kirk McCusick. And so through Eric, I became friends with Kirk and with the rest of the CSRG. That was in 1992 that I worked at Berkeley. And so that was my first real, I had used BSD systems before, but my introduction to people working on BSD was while I worked at the University of California, hanging out with the CSRG folks. And it was only later that I went to work at Wind River, and then much later that Wind River acquired BSDI. But I was not involved in that acquisition because you don't ask engineers about acquisitions.
I see. And it's good that you mentioned Kirk and you put yourself on the timeline when you got involved BSD the first time around. Therefore, it was before the lawsuit they had with AT&T.
So actually, it was about the same time that the lawsuit was being prosecuted. Let's see, I worked at the University of California in 92. I then moved to Holland and worked in Holland for about a year in 93. And the lawsuit, I think, finished up in 93. So when I came back from Holland, the first, I don't want to call them legally open source, but the first systems post the lawsuit were coming out. So I actually ran NetBSD on a laptop in Holland in the summer of 93. So that means the court case had to have resolved sometime in the spring. So I ran, I think, NetBSD 0.9. A bunch of us were working on a research project at the Universität Twente. And we had these really what would be considered completely archaic, compact 25 megahertz laptops that we used. Originally running Plan 9, which was our boss, who was the head of the research project, was friends with Rob Pike. So he was running Plan 9. We all hated Plan 9 because Plan 9 was almost like Unix, but not quite. And software that you tried to port, like you would try to port LaTeX and it wouldn't work because they had changed the system call interfaces or something like that. So about halfway through the year, Peter Bos, who I was working with, who was a graduate student at the time, and myself tried out NetBSD 0.9. Worked fine on the laptops. You could run LaTeX, which is what we cared about for writing our papers. And everyone in the group except our boss switched from Plan 9 to NetBSD.
As we mentioned the lawsuit, you jumped way ahead of my flow of thoughts I had here laid out for myself. As you mentioned the lawsuit, there was one question I had to ask you. Do you think that, as we know that Linus Torvalds goes ahead and creates the Linux kernel about the time when the lawsuit is still ongoing. He claims that there were no suitable operating system at that time for whatever his purpose or his needs were. Do you think that if BSD is not being held up in a lawsuit back in the day, today we probably wouldn't have Linux, and or BSD would be the place where Linux is today?
So, I mean, it's hard to rerun history in that way. It's quite possible. And when we look at sort of uptake of BSD and Linux, it has always, the amount of uptake, the number of users, the number of companies using it has always trailed Linux by about the amount of time that the lawsuit took to resolve. So many people certainly believe that. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what Linus would have done if he had been exposed to BSD instead of Minix, because Linux was a reaction to Andy Tannenbaum's Minix, which was being done at the Freie Universität when Andy, I mean, he's just retired a couple years ago, but Tannenbaum was at the Freie Universität at the time. And Linus's Linux was a reaction to Minix as opposed to other Unixes. I mean, at the time of the lawsuit, it was still the case that a BSD style system was more expensive. BSDI sold you source for $1,000 US. $1,000 in $1993 is a lot of money, certainly for a student. You know, many of us were exposed to BSD because the universities had already paid the licensing fee. So in the United States, if you went to a university, you almost always got exposed to some BSD system. Even in 1985, my first BSD-like system was on a early SMP mini computer, which was huge. Took up it would take up more than the space in this room. I called a Pyramid, and Pyramid's OS was a port of 4.3 BSD, I think, or 4.2. So for students in the United States and in many other places, but definitely in the US, we were being exposed to BSD because it's what university CS departments were willing to pay $1,000 or get some machine that had it ported to it, running on it. Whereas, you know, trying to run BSD on a home mini computer, which is incredibly expensive, was something that just people didn't do. The closest you could get, I'll go backwards in time. I'll go slightly backwards in time in my own timeline. For a multitasking Unix-like system, for a home system, were the Commodore Amiga computers, which ran, they had something called a Xenu kernel, which is a pun on Unix, of course. They were multi-process, not multiprocessor. They were multiprocess. You know, it really looked a lot more like a Unix than, say, similarly configured machines at the time. They had a much more powerful processor. But, you know, running in 1990, 91, 92, 93, running Unix on a machine that cost less than several $1,000s was really not something most people were going to be able to do.
Indeed. To go back for just 1 second to your time in River and VxWorks, as you were always into the embedded computing and doing low-level things, then what piqued your interest in this was the complexity it gave you, or the challenge, what it means working embedded systems and so close to the hardware, as opposed to just writing applications and cash out similar fees or success, or however you want to call it?
So what always attracted me to embedded systems, there were a few things. One is they're difficult to get right. So it's not so much complexity as you're not protected, right? When you do kernel programming, you're not protected from your own mistakes. Whereas if you're writing an application program, the operating system will tell you if you've made a mistake. In an embedded system, sometimes the most you'll get is a red light, and then you have to go figure out what's going on. But also embedded systems, especially then, but even now, are used in application areas that I'm interested in. So my interest is in, high performance networking, or, very low level questions of performance and traceability. I've worked on dtrace and things like that in FreeBSD. So the embedded world gave me access to that. Also, I like embedded systems because I also really prefer portability. So I like working on devices that can be placed anywhere. Server farms are uninteresting to me. They're just sort of big masses of Intel hardware. Whereas, when I was working at Wind River in particular, your code had to be incredibly portable because it would run on both NDNISs, right? Intel and Motorola at the time. But we weren't just running on Intel and Motorola. We did Intel, Motorola, Hitachi, ARM. There was something like 7 IBM RS-6000, which is what all of our spacecraft were using VxWorks on. So we were porting to 6 or 7 different architectures all at once, and that was quite interesting.
That makes me wonder that you ended up in FreeBSD, whereas NetBSD is the one most known of that those guys want to run BSD on a microwave oven. So for you, it pretty much could have been just the perfect candidate, no?
So the reason I wound up in the world of FreeBSD, and I had started in NetBSD, was one of my other interests, and I have many, is portable computing. I like the idea that my workstation is in my backpack, and I can basically, as long as I have clean clothes and a laptop, I can be anywhere. I don't have to be at home, except when there's a pandemic. I travel quite extensively, and I like to work remote. I am not a big fan of offices. In fact, I really don't like being in an office. So at the time of NetBSD 1-ish and early FreeBSD, because FreeBSD had this focus on stability and performance on Intel hardware, it meant that I could get a cheap, well, relatively cheap Intel notebook and then put FreeBSD on it, and I would have my workstation with me all the time. And that had been a goal ever since I was a kid. My first portable computer was a TRS Model 100, which is a ridiculously limited piece of hardware. I had a luggable. I had always had a very strong interest in portable computing. And so at the time, FreeBSD was way more solid on an Intel laptop. I had a WinBook, which was an early Intel laptop. I'd had the Compact in Europe when I lived in Holland. And then this WinBook was my first one back in the States. And FreeBSD just ran really well on it. It's also the same thing that brought me to the point of working with Apple hardware. So I always carry 2 laptops. I have a MacBook Pro, in part because it's FreeBSD enough, and also in part because I deal with clients whose the only choices of platforms you get are Mac or Windows, and I'm not running Windows. So, I always have a MacBook Pro, and then I always have some FreeBSD-based laptops. So for a long time, it was Lenovo's. At the moment, I've just switched to a Dell. Dell does an XPS 13 that is meant for Ubuntu, which to my mind meant, okay, well, those device drivers are going to be available. So I switched this year to a Dell XPS that runs FreeBSD. It actually runs it really fast. I don't quite know how they do that. I think they're doing something thermally that's a bad idea. So I always travel with 2 laptops, the MacBook and the MacBook Pro and the FreeBSD laptop. But it was portable computing, laptop computing that brought me to FreeBSD initially, because it quote just worked. The NetBSD thing of running on all the hardware is quite interesting. If I retired and opened a computer museum, it would be great fun because they also run on everything old. Like they'll still run on a VAX. Yeah. I can't fit a VAX in my New York apartment, but I could see the reason to do it.